Please welcome to the stage Grameen America President and CEO Andrea Jung and Seneca Women co-founder Kim Azzarelli.
Hello.
Hello.
Well, thank you for being here with us today. It is a pleasure, as always, to be together, and you'll find out that we've been together for a long time. Today we're going to talk about wealth inequality, and let's start by talking a bit about Grameen, the work you're doing there, and really what you're seeing for women at the lowest end of the economic pyramid and how they're hit these days and what can be done about it.
Sure. Great to be with you, Kim, and great to be here. Wealth inequality, I think there's sort of two tracks to it to put the context to Grameen. One is financial inclusion, access to capital, and the other was obviously wage parity and gender wage parity. And neither is happening at the rate it should be for women, which is exacerbating the inequality issue. But to start with the first, which is access to capital, that's kind of where Grameen comes into place. And if I go all the way back for a second to Bangladesh, Grameen America is a replica of the Grameen Bank in a way that was founded over 40 years ago on the very simple premise by Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus that there's no way that they could bridge the inequality issues, help the country move up and out of poverty without including half the population in the country. And 40 plus years ago, if a woman went to the bank, she would literally be told, bring your husband. That's the only way we're going to give you a loan. Essentially, the entire capital system did not give loans to women. And Yunus's firm belief then and now is that credit is a basic human right and that everybody, including women and half the population, has to have that right. But there was a situation there, if I just give you a data context in the United States in 2016, $1 out of $23, so 4% of loan capital to entrepreneurs went to women in the United States of America. So it's not just Bangladesh, it's alive and well, even in the richest economy in the world. Women are disproportionately disadvantaged from access to capital. So without financial inclusion, without being banked, without getting a credit score, and therefore being credit worthy, we're closing women out of the cycle, especially those in poverty, and that just furthers the inequality issue.
So to people who would say that that's not a good credit risk, what is the answer from Muhammad Yunus's perspective and then from yours?
Extraordinary. For those of you that have watched or heard the stories of the Grameen Bank and the Nobel Prize awarded in 2006, was a story of taking what society deems as the most credit unworthy population, gives them small, non-recourse, non-collateral loans, and had a near 100% repayment rate, which is completely counterintuitive because the traditional financial system would spit out an algorithm that said you are not credit worthy, and therefore we're not going to give you a loan. And if it was difficult in the United States before 2008, particularly for low income, particularly for minorities, it was completely impossible after the credit crisis, when financial institutions were pulling back. And if you were credit unworthy before, you were even more credit unworthy in a period of high risk. So the organization, interestingly, Grameen America, started in 2008. And people were saying, who would start a lending institution to those deemed credit unworthy in the middle of this crisis with non-collateral loans?
And many said microfinance couldn't work in the US.
And a lot of people were skeptical that that's fine for India, it's fine for Bangladesh, it's fine for Africa, but is it really going to work in the richest nation? And the pilot was right here in New York, just a subway ride away. And 10 years later, same thing, 99.6% repayment rate to over 100,000 women and their families in 14 cities here. The average loan size is about $2,200. The first time loan I give you, Kim, if you come, is only $1,500, and people say, well, what can $1,500 do? And the answer 100,000 families later is extraordinary things, very inspirational ability to help families with a hand up, not a handout, to give them access to capital that the system would not give them. Their only other option in the United States is usury rate, loan sharks. And that's just not a way to get them in. So the program gives out the actual capital, we help them be banked. We're not a regulated bank, but we have partner financial institutions that help them build a first-time bank account. 1 out of 2, particularly female-headed households in the United States, is unbanked.
It's amazing.
I mean, so when you talk about inequality, you just have to begin somewhere and get the concept of savings. And I think the numbers that we quote all the time is that if a family just has $500 to $800 savings, which can make a huge difference for an emergency in any way, that discipline itself helps them have a 5 times greater chance that their child will go on to university. So one of the things that we do, our members don't come and they have never saved. And we say, even if you save $3 a week, it's just actually the behavioral discipline of saving a little bit every week then ends up with, we've had millions of dollars of savings now in our partner banks. And that makes a huge difference because, that then begins to improve the issue of inequality. And then the third piece is credit scores. Our members come with no credit score or a poor credit score, mostly from bad credit card, education. And in 26 weeks, then they can get a credit score of over 640, which, as you know, is a pretty respectable score. And women at all tiers who don't have their own credit apart from their husbands or apart from their family, it's a real critical enabler to financial inclusion in the United States.
So you're closing on $1 billion loaned in the U.S.?
So yeah, we've served over 100,000 families, and this year, 10 years later, we'll have dispersed $1 billion, which was basically 99.6% repaid, non-collateral loans.
Sounds like a good.
Helping entrepreneurs.
So, dealing with 100,000 women CEOs, let us take you back from a different vantage point. You were CEO of Avon. In fact, when you were CEO of Avon, I was your corporate secretary. So we're talking about 15 years ago. We started a conversation about.
You were so young.
Yeah, we started a conversation. I've had to be next to her for 15 years. Can you imagine? She still looks the same. So we started a conversation 15 years ago about the glass ceiling, or as we sometimes call it, the thick layer of men, right? We started that conversation 15 years ago, and here we are again today at this incredible summit, and the pace has been glacial. I mean, let's call it what it is, glacial. So one of the youngest women CEOs, Fortune 500 companies, sitting on the boards of GE, of Mercedes. She chairs the comp committee of Apple. Reaching something like, what, $1 trillion in market cap this year? Just,
Shortly,
small company.
almost.
And we heard earlier today that actually Apple got an A- rating on the gender pay. So that's good news. Thank God, because I wouldn't be happy sitting here with you as chair of the comp committee if it wasn't the case. But what is going on in corporate America, and why do you think it's been such a glacial change?
Well, let me just start with CEO-ship for a minute, and then we can come to gender pay and wage equality. So when I became the CEO in 1999, I think I was the third. So there were 3 out of 500, so that rounds to 0 mathematically. That was 1999. I think it's 5% or 6% today. I think there's 32. And so certainly progress on one hand, but that's like more than 15 years ago. Later. And so, that's, I think we would all call that glacial if you just still look at the numbers of the women leading Fortune 500 companies. I am, though, a glass half full person on this because when I look at the women in the key jobs, right under the CEO or in what I would call CEO-ready positions, that's vastly different. In the age I grew up in, you were the head of HR, the head of communications, and maybe the head of marketing, which I was, but you weren't the head of operating divisions necessarily, or the CFO, et cetera. And when I look at the number of CFOs, chief operating officers, major division, largest P&L that are women, the pipeline is very different than it was 10 years ago, or even 5 years ago. And I think that is going to, so I think the next 10 years is going to look very different. So 0% to 6% women CEOs at the top in over 15 years, glacial. But I am more optimistic that we're reaching an inflection point now.
I mean, we talked earlier, I think Carolyn and Milan talked earlier today about the pipeline myth, and that we're still hearing that there are not women in the pipeline. And we know that's just untrue, right? I mean, it's just, as you say, mathematically not true if you look around. So what is it then? What is going on?
Well, I mean, let's even move to the, the wage gap. I mean, it's to me, I don't know how much dialogue we need to have about what it's going to take. I don't think this takes policy. It doesn't take laws. It just simply takes leadership. If you're not asking the question, I mean, it's crazy. To me, this is one of the simplest things. There are a lot of big issues, in terms of equality, equal rights, and there are things that are going to take a significant amount of time. Equal pay for the same job is not one of them. It's absolutely insane in 2018 that that's not solved. So whether you are a CEO, the head of HR, the compensation consultant that's advising a company, board member, audit, compensation committee chair, if you're not asking the question and just looking at the data and then making the change, nobody has to do anything except just make the change. If you took 2 weeks to get the data, it would take you 2 days to make the decision. And I would argue, and I'm sure, look, I've been there trying to make earnings per share every quarter. But today, in today's world, with what's going on, if somebody said, listen, I spent 4 cents a share to, what was that 4 cents a share that wasn't projected? We made a one-time decision to pay equally, to close the gap. I ask who's going to stand up and scream. I mean, and if they do, just keep going, because there's no other way to solve this, and it's the simplest of all the issues that we have to deal with, because the data is there now. The data.
I love it.
There's so much data that's there. I mean, I think there was the McKinsey report that came out at Davos a couple years ago that said, I mean, it's $28 trillion of global GDP if we simply allow participation and equality in pay. Just simply mathematically, if there were equality in participation in the workforce and equality in pay for same job, that's $28 trillion of global GDP. So the data is there, but data doesn't get equality. Only leadership does. So, I mean, that's the frustration, but the opportunity. And I think that there are certain things, and equal pay is one, that everybody can just do. We don't need board participation, probably the same thing. It's interesting. I would love to think that you don't need legislation, but I was on the Daimler Mercedes-Benz board in Germany, and I'm now on the Unilever board. And in Europe, it's interesting because it was a glacial pace, but legislation has made a difference. It absolutely has. And
you're talking to a lawyer. So I'd like
to
hear
I mean, there's no question that this concept of, and pick a number, arbitrary 30%, should it be 50? It doesn't matter, but 30% of women on boards and in leadership. And I look at a company and they did an extraordinary job, but there is 30% participation, not just on the board, in what is perceived as a very male-dominated industry, the automotive industry, but also in management. And I think there were times, certainly in Germany as other countries, where people were saying, well, only 9% of people coming out of engineering school are women, so how can we have 30%?
The pipeline myth.
So it's the pipeline myth. Meantime, they're there with extraordinarily powerful and great qualified female engineers. Look at Mary Barra. I mean, people are out there, and so.
And you saw it happen at Mercedes.
If you look at you have to go back to, I think Mel just talked about, who's your client, but who are buying cars?
Right.
80% of the passenger car decisions are being made by women.
Yeah.
Is it a minivan or a four-door sedan? Is it red or is it blue? I mean, the consumer decisions are being made all over the world by women, so why shouldn't the boards and management represent really the customer base? It's just that simple.
One of my favorite stories from a board member of Avon, Ann Moore, she had told me many years ago that when she was starting People magazine, she wanted to pivot People magazine to the women reader. And the publisher at Time Inc. at the time said, oh, no, if you do that, we're going to lose all the advertisers. We're going to lose Detroit. We're going to lose automotive. Forget it. You're going to sink the business. And so she went in and she put video cameras, because back then you needed video cameras, in the parking lots. And when people would come out, they would say, oh, what car did you buy? And most of the time it was a woman. And she went back and said, listen, look who's making the purchasing decisions. And of course, she became the CEO of Time Inc. I don't know what happened to the publisher, but she was obviously right. But that was in the 90s, right? So we're still making the case today that women control 80% of purchasing power. And we keep having to make the business case. But I think what you said before is really critical, that we have the data and now we need leadership, because we don't need to make the case over and over again. The data is clear. But what do you think about this sort of idea that legislation could come to the U.S.? I mean, disclosure, obviously I'm a disclosure lawyer, so I'm for disclosure, but you said something interesting before about activism.
Well, yeah, I'm actually seeing on the issue of equality, diversity, representation, that there's probably more activism going on than legislation in the U.S., which is, it's a different angle, maybe of the same thing. It's easier, though, to me. That means just be your own activist. Right. Don't wait for someone to run a proxy fight or to stand up at your annual meeting demanding a, transparency of pay, and do it before it gets asked, because you can see it now. You can see it in Silicon Valley. You can see it all over. That if it's not a law, there's enough energy around it, and there's enough activism around it, which is obviously a trend in the corporate boardroom and in corporate governance in the United States. So my answer there is quickly be your own activist. Make the changes before somebody else, and maybe it's activism first, and then if that doesn't work, regulation in the United States, but it can't stay still, because the glacial pace has to get broken.
I have to make a plug for this in the magazine this week for the summit. Can laws make us equal? And I think it's a super interesting article. I mean, we know, for example, paid maternity leave, that we're one of two countries, esteemed countries with, not having paid maternity leave, us and Papua New Guinea, right? And there's I think over 100 countries in the world with discriminatory laws on the books, including the U.S. So I think this dance between legislation and policy, but to your point, activism among the leaders themselves is what it's going to take. And so do you have any parting words for what leaders in this room can do? And from Silicon Valley to Germany, I mean, what's your takeaway?
I think the data is here. I think all of us who've read the reports, seen the research, I mean, it's getting, there's so many conferences, and you walk out saying, wow, the case is made, but then it really does come to just taking the action. You don't need the activists to show up, which, if that doesn't work, as I said, will end up being policy, and that will take however long it takes to get through the federal and state system. And my opinion is, if not now, then when?
Right.
If not us, then who? I mean, that's really that's all I can say. If not us, then who?
Well, I'm going to close with that and make another shameless plug for our app, because when you say action, this idea that we each have to take action every day, and I mean, that is our goal, right? To give people actionable things to do. Yes. So thank you for this, and thank you for your leadership on these issues.
Thank you.